Well, welcome to Virtual Vintage today. It's wonderful to see your faces arriving to join us today. Hey, Hunter, and Carrie from Atlanta, and Rowena from Richmond, and our special guests, Tim Jones and Ellen Foster, to speak with us today on the topic of anxiety. And this is a part of an ongoing series that we've been pursuing this spring called God and the Good Life. We've talked about health and power and money and relationships. And back in January, when I invited Tim and Ellen to come, of course, we were expecting to be together in person, but I'm so thankful that we were able to make this work and to be together with you today. Across the miles. As we begin, I want to make a few notes, sort of logistical notes about our hour together. Ellen and Tim are going to speak to us for 25 minutes or however long they'd like to do that. And then we'll turn to a time of question and answer. And of course, anxiety is a topic that is of interest to all of us, regardless of our age. But this current moment is especially challenging for you students, you University of Virginia students. Classes are ending. I know my daughter Nam's in the basement online doing her work, and many other students are at home and in other places. You're looking towards a period of exams, and then beyond that, this great unknown of summer and beyond. And so I've asked Tim and Ellen today to really focus on the university experience for students. If you're a non-student, I'm so happy you're here to join us as a kind of an observer and a participant. And I know that you too will have, hear some insights that benefit you. I'm recording this conversation, and so questions that we have for Tim and Ellen, if you're a student and you have a question, I would invite you to chat it to me in the chat box, chat it privately, and that way I'll be able to ask it on your behalf. It will remain anonymous, and yet we can hear your question, record this session, and share it afterwards. You can keep your camera on, off, you're all muted. Sorry about that, but I want to give the floor to Tim and Ellen. And before I introduce them, I'd like to offer up a prayer. This is from John O'Donoghue, a wonderful Irish poet who wrote a book of blessings. This is called For Equilibrium. Like the joy of the sea coming home to shore, may the relief of laughter rinse through your soul. As the wind loves to call things to dance, may your gravity be lightened by grace. Like the dignity of moonlight restoring the earth, may your thoughts incline with reverence and respect. As water takes whatever shape it is in, so free may you be about who you become. As silence smiles on the other side of what's said, may your sense of irony bring perspective. As time remains free of all that it frames, may your mind stay clear of all it names. May your prayer of listening deepen enough to hear the depths, the laughter of God. Amen. Amen. So our hope for you is this blessing allows you a prayer of listening today. As we hear from Ellen and Tim. Tim is the director of New City Counseling here in Charlottesville. Tim Jones is also a counselor there. He has 12 years of clinical experience as a nationally board certified counselor, and he's a member of the American Association of Christian Counselors. Tim lives here in Charlottesville with his wife and 6 children. He also serves on the staff of Trinity Presbyterian Church, directing the areas of community and congregational care. Ellen is the assistant director and a counselor at New City Counseling. She holds a bachelor's degree in social work and a master's degree in counseling from Reformed Theological Seminary. I read that she enjoys hiking, running, and cooking, which are all activities apparently she's been able to continue during this time of quarantine. So I'm so pleased that you're here, and I know you have some plans for how you'd like to begin this topic together. So welcome, Ellen. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first, we want to thank all of you virtually for showing up and giving of your time and attention this afternoon. And I want to thank you, Karen, especially for the privilege of interacting with all of you around this important topic. This topic of anxiety is a pretty obvious choice to address, as we are all now living in the midst of a global pandemic, which seems surreal to even say. But this topic was chosen even before COVID-19 happened to us, because of course it's always relevant. And particularly for UVA students, which many of you are or have been. I've lived in Charlottesville long enough to know the intense pressures faced and felt by UVA students, and the fact that anxiety is often hovering at the top of many students' emotional experience. But it's, of course, even broader than just UVA students. In studies over the past few years, over 40% of college students rate anxiety as their top presenting concern. And some scholars are calling our time a new age of anxiety, beginning at 9/11/2001, which means that many of you, at least those of you who are in college, can't remember a time when this anxiety wasn't in the air that we breathe, the waters that we swim in. We feel it, we know it, and what we'd like is just to find a way for the symptoms, the feelings of anxiety to go away. And as someone who struggles with anxiety, I'm very sympathetic to this desire. But what we want to invite you to is to actually settle in and listen to it for a moment. What is it saying to you? As our title suggests, we want to pay more attention to our anxiety. We want to invite you to do something very counterintuitive. Right? Anxiety is always pushing us forward into the future. We want to invite you for a few moments to consider getting present with it. So that's our hope for this time together. So briefly, we want to talk about understanding our anxiety from a frame that comes from Christian theology. And just a side note, there's lots of ways to understand the rise in anxiety, discussing things like the rise in social media or breakdown of social networks, etc. We're not going to address those particular things and that angle in this talk, but we're happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But we're going to talk about understanding it from a biblical frame, noticing it, particularly in our bodies, integrating it with our stories, and then some practical steps towards restoring it. So first, understanding it. And maybe a common definition would help. I think about anxiety as experiencing present stress about a possible future reality. Or as Merriam-Webster defines it, apprehensive uneasiness or nervousness, usually over an impending or anticipated ill. So anxiety is entirely wrapped up in mistrust that there will be security in the most crucial and important areas of our lives. Right? And this is a problem. We don't like to feel this way. So whenever we try to accurately diagnose something that is wrong, we must first have a sense of what is right, of what health is. So the Bible teaches that the world and all the relationships embedded in it, the relationship with God, with each other, with our own selves, with the creation itself, that it was created to be in harmony with security, connection, and stability. That we were created to flourish in this web of relationships. And in the fall of humanity, all such security, stability, and connection was fractured. Life was now full of uncertainty, of pain, and destruction. So the sense of apprehensive uneasiness entered the world for the first time, and it has cast a shadow throughout history and into the present. And we all feel this. There is a kind of certainty of stability about life and relationships that all of us long for, but don't get to fully experience. I can remember vividly several years ago when my wife was diagnosed with cancer, and my 5-year-old daughter asked me if mom was going to die. And I had to say, I don't know. And this is not the kind of answer a little girl needs in that moment, right? But it's a profound example of the impact of the fall on what we long for and what we actually experience. So what is humankind to do? How do we deal with such a situation that we found ourselves in? And throughout the biblical narrative, we see two paths open in regards to this dilemma, two ways of dealing with anxiety. And the first is to find various created things to give your life meaning, stability, and security. So, for example, we create agricultural technology to provide an abundance of food or other necessary provisions. Or we create engineering technology to forge weapons to gain military and political power. Or we use interpersonal skills to form contacts that give relational capital. Like all sorts of ways that we human beings use what we have, the created things, to develop structures of security and stability. And these structures can be very effective in silencing our anxiety, or at least putting them on pause. They are effective until at some point they begin to fail. At which point, depending on the weight we are placing on these things, we begin to experience compounded anxiety. Not only are we anxious about the broken world that we live in, but we also feel anxious about keeping the structures that protect us from the broken world in place. And this compounded anxiety that we all live with is at varying levels, but we feel this. And the second way to deal with our anxiety is to look to the Creator God to provide meaning, stability, and security. But this is also a challenge, right? The ways of the Creator, his timing, his methods, they don't always make sense to us. If you just look at the book of Genesis, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the ways that they continually took matters into their own hands in trying to make God's promises come true because, frankly, he didn't seem to be showing up. We can all relate to this as well. The Creator God promises to provide stability and security, but his way often seems very hard to us. So both of these ways of dealing with our anxiety exist in the same context, that is, an unstable and insecure world full of pain that will eventually reach all of us. These are both challenges. But even though they exist in the same context, there's a major difference. The first way of responding is always future-oriented, always making sure that you can make your life work for the future, either financially, in regards to your physical safety, relational connection, etc. You can never stop because there is always more uncertain future to attend to. The second way, if pursued in the way the Creator God invites, is always about the present. It calls for faithful living in whatever present you are in seeking the presence of the Creator, who didn't leave the world broken, but has come and acted powerfully to begin to mend the world. So the more we can seek, understand, and practice the intimate presence of God, the less anxiety will have a hold on us. But, and I want to stress this practicing living in his intimate presence is always done in the context of an unstable world. So it is not easy. To briefly illustrate this, think about Jesus' words in Matthew 10, right? He's speaking about our fears and anxieties, and he says, "But even the hairs on your head are numbered." Think about that. As Karen mentioned, I've got a whole bunch of kids in this house. And I loved holding my newborn babies and studying each part of their little bodies. But even I didn't know how many hairs were on their heads. This is an incredible intimacy that he speaks of God with his children. And then just 4 chapters later in the book of Matthew, Jesus' cousin John has his head with all of its hair chopped off. It is in the midst of such tragic violence that Jesus speaks of an incredible intimacy that is on offer. And this is similar to Psalm 23, which is famous for a reason, because it combines these two realities. One, that we experience the shadow of death, that we walk through and existing in the presence of our enemies. These are the things that cause anxiety for us. But God promises to give provision and comfort in the midst of this, to intimately shepherd us. This is ultimately what we long for. So this dynamic of living in an unstable, insecure world of pain and struggle as a result of the fall, and having to choose daily whether to look to the Creator versus created things for stability and security, and seeking his intimate presence in the midst of the brokenness, is a sketch of a biblical picture of the dynamics of anxiety. Now, how do we notice it or become aware of it in our lives? There's a great quote from William James, the founder of American psychology, who said, "The great thing then in all education is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy." So Ellen's going to speak to how in noticing our bodies, we can make our nervous system our ally.
Thanks. Yeah, so as Tim said, I think it's important to use the very thing that is always with us. Tim talked about the importance of presence. Well, the thing that is always present with us is our body. And it feels important as we move into this space about talking about our bodies that we also mentioned that in anxiety, there's a spectrum of anxiety, and we all may experience that on different levels. So I just want to make a nod to that, that all of us probably experience anxiety on some level, because we live in this unstable, unsafe world, and that can cause some fear. But what we often talk to our clients about in this idea of levels of anxiety is the role that medication can potentially play. And the important thing I think to note there is exactly what Tim was saying, is that we, in order to do this noticing and this paying attention, our nervous systems have to be at a place of kind of rest and homeostasis. It's not always perfect, but sometimes medication can bring us down to a level where we actually can do this practice of noticing. So just wanted to acknowledge that. I'm happy to address that more in the Q&A if you'd like. But we do have these physical experiences and manifestations of anxiety a lot of times. It can be increased heart rate. It can be shortness of breath, racing thoughts, feeling fidgety, or having difficulty sleeping, just to name a few. And these are generally kind of the signs, the outward signs of deeper emotional things that are going on. And God created us in his image, and part of that image, he decided we're going to be these physical bodies that we have. And they're meant to be revelatory of something of God. And our bodies in scriptures are often referred to as temples, and that we should treat them as such. Not that we worship our bodies, but as we're created in the image of God, that we would take care of and pay attention to these vessels we've been given. So to the degree that we're willing to be connected to and present with our own bodies, I think is the degree to which we're able to live as fully as possible in kind of this broken world, into the life of peace and shalom that we long for. So if peace is the opposite of anxiety, and we say we want to experience the peace and not the anxiety, I think our natural inclination is to try to get rid of the thing we don't want. And logically, I think that makes total sense. But I think the hard part about that is we try to do the end run by either thinking our way or behavior manage our way out of our anxiety. And I think the problem there is that our bodies are trying to tell us something more than just our thoughts might be able to. Our bodies hold and store so much of our lives. And Tim will talk more about this when he starts talking about story. And so the thing that feels on offer, but which Tim mentioned is harder, is actually sitting in our anxiety, in our bodies, to see what it might be trying to tell us. And as one of my supervisors, Lynn Wynn, has said, we want to linger longer in our anxieties or confusion or fear, not because we want to stay there forever, but because we want to know the contours of it so well that we might actually be able to discern a little more of what's going on. So this idea that our emotions aren't meant to control us, but if we're willing to pay attention to them, we actually have a little bit more agency. And it's from that place of connection and presence that our physical beings are able to move more in wisdom and love rather than fear and anxiety. And so our emotions are this felt experience, right? We feel them on a physical level. And lots of us, myself included, as I also struggle with anxiety, try to keep our emotions at a cognitive level. And here's what author Bessel van der Kolk, in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, says about this. As long as we register emotions primarily in our heads, we can remain pretty much in control. But feeling as if our chest is caving in or we're being punched in the gut is unbearable. We'll do anything to make it stop. Cling to another human, numb ourselves with drugs or alcohol, take a knife to our skin to replace the overwhelming sense of emotion. And I think here's what he's getting at is that to stay cognitive feels safe to us, but to actually allow ourselves to feel the emotions of anxiety or confusion or fear, along with joy, gratitude, and peace, that feels scary. It feels out of control. And so a lot of us just want to ignore those things. And so what he and others are saying is that our bodies actually have a lot to tell us if we're willing to listen. And so, and what they have to say, I think this is important, what they have to say, though it feels uncomfortable, is actually for us and for our good. And that's the same posture that God takes toward us. And so practically speaking, what it looks like to pay attention to your body, there's probably lots of ways, but one really practical, fairly easy, and you can do this on your own, is what some people will call a body scan. And what a body scan is you just sit in a chair or lay on the floor, whatever feels comfortable to you. I generally like to sit and plant my feet on the floor because I feel grounded to something. And I generally close my eyes, and then starting with 3 or 4 long, slow, deep breaths. And that air and oxygen is actually what helps slow your nervous system down so that you can do the kind of under work of paying attention to your body. And so then you start with your head and you work your way all the way down to your toes, every part of your body, and you just notice. You just notice really non-judgmentally, actually, not trying to understand it all, make meaning. Oh my gosh, my shoulders are tight. What does that mean? Don't start there. Just start with noticing where you hold tension or where you feel relaxed. Maybe that your stomach is kind of knotted. So much of the time, unless I stop, I don't even know that I'm tense. I don't know that I'm stressed. And yet in my interactions with other people, they can tell something's going on and they're reading that, right? And so this is not only for yourself and your anxiety, but also for the care of others as you interact with them. So that's a little bit of what that looks like. And now Tim is going to talk a little bit about how once you begin to pay attention to that, you can also begin to think about your own personal story.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that we all have one of 2 paths. We share this decision of taking one of 2 paths with our anxiety, either towards the creator, God, or toward these created structures. But the shape of our anxieties are different based on our stories. So for example, we could all in this virtual space experience the same event, but our interpretations of it will be different based on a number of factors from the stories of our lives. So why is it not enough simply to be aware of the anxiety in our bodies that Ellen talked about, and then to turn to the Creator God for comfort? I mean, if it was that easy, none of you would have tuned in today to hear us talk, right? All of us, to varying degrees, have pain that we've pushed aside, or idolatries that we've cultivated that are in the way of this turning to God. And unless and until we attend specifically to them, we will struggle. Wrestling with a series of questions can help us learn the shape of the pain in our lives and idolatries that we've cultivated. So questions such as, what were my early attachments or connections with my parents or caregivers like? And how do we feel now about making and maintaining deep relationships? This place of insecure or unstable attachment is a place where anxiety often covers underlying issues. Or maybe a question like, are there events from my past that when I think of them now, I recoil? And what triggers me to think back to these things now in the present? Past events that cause powerful present reactions are not actually in the past. And we spend lots of energy trying to keep them away from us. And this often manifests in anxiety. Or a question like, what things were valued in my home and community growing up? Was it wealth or intelligence, athletic or artistic ability? And what happens inside me when I think I might not reach these standards? Or maybe most relevant to right now, as I think about the uncertainty of our new future, what aspects of the uncertainty of this future are most distressing to me, and why? So Ellen just talked about paying attention to our bodies, that our bodies can alert us to when we begin to feel anxious, and attending to our stories, asking these probing questions to get at the tender places in our hearts can help us find out what it is that drives our anxieties. They give a mouthpiece to our fears and our idolatries. So Ellen's going to end by briefly speaking to some of the things that we can do with these discoveries.
Mm-hmm. So now that we've kind of situated ourselves in this larger story of the biblical narrative, and we've talked about paying attention to our bodies, integrating that with the impact of our stories, now what do we do? And some of what I want to say about that is that it's probably less about doing and more about being. This idea of being present to and with ourselves. And I think first and foremost, generally, the invitation is to move toward yourself the same way God moves towards you, which is with kindness and compassion and curiosity. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. And as you've been willing to pay more attention, it's probably likely that you will see and know things that you didn't see before. You will see more of the whole picture and more of the whole truth. And in some ways that will be beautiful and good, and it will bring clarity and hopefully at some point relief to some of this anxiety. But what it may also reveal are things that that would invite grief, and grieving what was that shouldn't have been, or what wasn't that should have been. And this part feels especially important to me for those of us that may, on the outside, appear to have lived pretty charmed or comfortable lives. Our parents are still married. We're able to participate in all the activities we wanted to growing up. Our physical needs were met and more. We're attending a really great university. And the temptation here, I think, is to do sort of this, to compare ourselves to others, and therefore want to minimize our griefs and losses. And psychiatrist and author Kurt Thompson offers a really helpful way of thinking about this. He says, this is evil's playground. inviting us to pretend we don't really feel what we feel when we compare our circumstances to those of others, and in so doing, judge our own heart's longings as unimportant. This only leads to our minimizing the next loss, and then the next, and on it goes. The problem with this, he says, is that we begin to collect an entire library of small emotional losses that we then keep burying, yet have to burn energy to contain in our bodies. And then we wonder why we're so tired, irritable, even eventually depressed, not wanting to get out of bed, not wanting to bring beauty and goodness into the places of our lives. Even as we're in now, it seems like sometimes those physical spaces aren't changing very much. And so some of us who experience anxiety currently may have experienced it for much longer than we even realize. So this idea of paying attention to our bodies and our stories, what we may be invited to is to actually go back in our minds and our hearts to our younger selves and to sit with them, to offer him or her this unhurried space of our presence, to listen to what they have to say, to offer words of kindness and compassion that may not have been offered. I think it's often really easy to think, oh, this happened in the past, either it doesn't matter or I can't do anything about it. And in one sense, that's true. We can't change the past and we can't change the things we experienced. But what we can do is go back to that person and give him or her a different experience. And that helps us to then move into current and future relationships out of this place of wholeness and not out of anxiety and fear that Tim was sort of mentioning. So whether anxiety is something that's been with you your whole life, or whether it seems to be more recent given our current circumstances, I hope that you will follow the example of Jesus, which is this invitation to slow down, to increase your awareness of the present moment in order to receive his presence. His attentive gaze is always on you. And when he gazes at you, he is filled with delight. His eyes are full of compassion. And may it be so with your gaze upon yourself.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Tim, for this rich time of information and insight and theological reflection. I've been given 3 questions for you, and so I will ask these one after another. And for students who are on this call right now, if you'd like to add questions, just add them into the chat box, and I will do my best to read them out for Tim and Ellen. Just do that privately. So for either of you, the question is, how do we get our own counseling treatment and faith to work in tandem with each other in a society that constantly tells us to keep science and religion separate? Let me read that again. How do we get our own counseling treatment and faith to work in tandem with each other in a society that constantly tells us to keep science and religion separate?
That's a good question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, I could take a stab at it. I think specifically, well, even more generally, but beyond just anxiety, there are all kinds of ways to treat psychological disorders that don't have to do with a particular faith. That can be very effective. So with anxiety, for example, if you've got different kinds of anxiety disorders, OCD, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy to treat those symptoms is very effective, right? And CBT is not coming out of a particular faith tradition. However, I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about a picture of health, right? To sort of get at what is wrong, you have to figure out what is right. And science can't really tell us what is right, what health is, what emotional health is. There's not really an answer for that in science. So you have to start somewhere. So no matter if you're coming out of sort of a Christian faith or anywhere else, you have to ask that question, like, what does it tell me about what the good life is? And so I would just say, technique-wise, it can get at it. It can help us feel better. But in terms of getting at what the good life is, you have to have faith in something to get you there, to answer those questions. And so I think it's kind of a false dilemma that we're put in at times. And I would just say, don't live in it. Choose to actually ask a deeper question, which is, what does health mean? And why do I think that? Where does that come from? And that will get you into some kind of tradition that you have to speak out of. And I think the Christian tradition offers a very rich view of that.
Thank you.
I think that's right. I think I agree with everything Tim just said. And I think part of what he was getting at too is that I don't think it has to be this completely separate thing. I think there can be some integration, between, in our world, what we would call psychology and theology, sort of this faith science piece. So I don't know that it needs to be so separate. I think what Tim was saying is that science may not answer everything. But then for some people, faith is not going to answer everything. And I think science, and, I mentioned Kurt Thompson earlier, he does some phenomenal work with interpersonal neurobiology and all that we can learn for the ways that science is actually helping us understand how it is that our bodies were made. And as a Christian, we believe that God created that system. But I think it's important to pay attention to both. So I don't think that there needs to be such a separation sometimes.
Yeah, thank you for that. Next question, the student asks, how are we called to approach and care for the anxiety of our family members while maintaining our own anxieties? Do you have any tools for acting empathetically towards the anxiety of loved ones while caring for our own hearts as well?
That's a fantastic question, with no simple answers probably. But what I think I would offer is, I think there's a way. Everything we've said today is that it actually requires some work to pay attention to our anxieties. And so to the degree that we are only in control of ourselves, I think the way to be empathetic is to listen, but to know that you're not going to be able to fix that for them. And oftentimes, people who maybe aren't quite ready to do the work may demand answers to things that don't have answers. And so just to, I think, know kind of your own human limits, even as it relates to other people, that you're not going to be able to fix that for them. And to pay attention to what they're requiring of you. And if they're requiring you to fix it, you get to sort of decide to make some space from that sometimes, because you can't actually do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, this question seems like it's coming from a real place of compassion, of wanting to actually help the people that maybe you're quarantined with right now. And that's wonderful. And I think some of the ways that the tools that we use to help ourselves, like these kinds of deep breathing techniques or exercise, or like those are things we can obviously offer to our family members. And I would just echo what Ellen said. Sometimes you come back into a system that you've, as a college student, maybe come back into a system that is requiring you to play a certain role, and has always required you to play a certain role in that system, that it actually is very unhealthy. And you feel a pull towards, as you come back, being that person that you were, and fixing and attending to these anxieties of your family members. And it's not your role to play. And so part of it, and so you're actually doing more damage by doing that. You're enabling this person. And so I think actually drawing some boundaries and pointing them towards other resources outside of yourself and figuring out what your actual role in the family is actually a kindness as well. And so that's a more cynical view of of the relationships, but I think they both happen, right? And so I think yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. Yeah, and I do think, going back to the idea of story, when you've gone from college back home to your family, you've just walked back into a whole library of stories that you've played a part in.
Yeah.
Here's an additional question. During these times of anxiety and isolation, if you're finding an outlet with comfort food or drink, do you have any suggestions, Tim and Ellen, for ways to stop yourself?
I love this question. Sorry. Jump in first, Tim? Or do you want to go first?
No, go for it.
Okay. I mean, I love this question on so many levels, because the reality is, like, all of us are seeking comfort. We're all trying to avoid pain. I think that's part of what it means to be human. And now we're just all doing that collectively and kind of like on display. And so I just appreciate that sort of the honesty and rawness of the question. And I think a little bit of what I was saying earlier, this idea that we just want to like behavior manage our way out of things. Sometimes stopping certain things is actually very healthy. Like, if you find yourself drinking a lot, sure, maybe sort of stopping and having a little bit of sobriety from that is a good thing. If you're willing, well, that's probably period, but also it goes beyond that, right? It goes to, okay, well, what's driving me to want to do that? Like, what am I seeking comfort from? And so to like really honor yourself for seeking comfort, and honor yourself for the honesty of saying, maybe I'm finding it in ways that I'd rather not. I won't even say that are healthy or not, but just ways that I'd rather not. And I think also, this gets into like a lot of things, and there can be a spectrum of this with food where it can be overindulgence or underindulgence. And I think we live in a culture, and Charlottesville is certainly a place that's like fairly healthy in some ways. It's like health conscious. And so also to pay attention to this category of control. So like, how is whatever you're doing helping you find some sense of control? It's not surprising to me that all of us are going to whatever small sliver of control we feel like we have right now. So again, be gentle with yourselves. Like, if you eat the second piece of cake right now, it's probably not the end of the world. If you eat the whole thing, maybe pay attention. But I don't know. I think that's some of what I would say is like, continue to be curious about sort of what's underneath.
Yeah, I would agree. I would just add or emphasize that kindness to yourself. One of the things that we've found in our practices, the first couple of weeks of the quarantine, it was all about addressing this new place we're in, right? And what do you do with these new realities? And then people began to kind of settle into back to their own stuff they were dealing with before. But now they're realizing there's these new level of underground anxiety that we're feeling, and it's compounding with our own issues, right? And I think just kindness to yourself is so paramount right now. And I think I just want to stress, like, this is a hard time to make big decisions about life, about yourself, about judgments about yourself. So I would just stress compassion. And also what Ellen said about control, like food and drink are such powerful ways to like get a sense of control when you're feeling anxious. You can stuff down, your feelings with food or drink them away. And I just think those particular areas are so powerful. So one, I would say, if you're alone in this, like find other people to be in it with in terms of community. Have people asking you the hard questions of how much are you eating and drinking? How much do you want to be? How can we help each other with that? Because left to our own, it's almost impossible to do it in community. Find ways to let other people into your struggle. And then like that kindness and what Ellen said about asking the deeper question that's beyond that is super important.
Well, I would love to hear from you during this time. I mean, so many of the so many routes of access to mental health care and to support, community have vanished for now. What kind of resources are you recommending, or would you point us to? And I'd like to note that we'll be posting this video at the Theological Horizons website, and so I'll have some show notes. So you can just mention any resources, and as you think of other articles or spaces or online communities or therapists, we'll add those as well. But just what comes up for you in terms of what we might do now if we're looking for support or doing some of this work with someone else or other organizations?
Yeah. I can go, or you can go. I mean, this won't be a shock to Tim, and he probably would say it too. I mean, I can mention specific resources. One is to note also that like a lot of people are still doing virtual counseling. And so if you're finding yourself wanting that, most places are able to provide that. So just to know that. Mm-hmm. And I think this category of grief feels really, really important to me. Again, Kurt Thompson right now is my go-to guy. But he wrote a really incredible article just a couple days ago, just about the importance of naming our griefs, because otherwise they do store themselves in our bodies, and then they're not getting metabolized out. And there's a lot of loss right now. And so I think to cultivate this practice of grief and lament feels important. Not, again, because that's all we want to do or that's all there is to do. But I think that grief has this interesting way of expanding us. And so as we grieve, we sort of become larger and we make more space for more things. And so my hope is that eventually, though there will always be grief present with us, that there also would be a lot of space for joy and gratitude and peace. Mm-hmm. So those are a couple things. I might think of more, but I want to give Tim time too.
Great.
Yeah, Kurt's been very helpful in terms of resources. I have found that there's been an inundation of articles or resources that come at us through all kinds of our feeds that we're on that it almost feels impossible to sift through. So finding trusted voices is important. But I would say beyond just mental health resources, and like Ellen said, most people are still doing telehealth and psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors. What's been super helpful for me is finding rhythms and order and liturgy to my days and to my life now that maybe I didn't have before, that seem and feel especially important now. And so, through our own at Trinity, we have resources for that. Maybe your churches that you're at have resources, but finding ways to have order to the different parts of your life right now, I think is one of the best things you can do for your mental health in this time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll share a link to a webinar that Theological Horizons co-sponsored this week on practices for this pandemic time with Justin Early,
yeah, that's right,
which really enforced that idea. Well, for anyone who has not, who would like to begin with counseling, and you mentioned virtual counseling, who are somebody who's not connected already with that option, do you have recommendations for places to go? I mean, New City Counseling, I don't know if y'all have availability or anyway, somewhere to begin for someone who's looking.
We do. Well, maybe we could do this, Karen. We can post on your site our list of referrals, and just to say, we know people in different communities kind of around the country, and so if you're somewhere else and you're looking for recommendations, we'd be happy to connect with you and help with that. But we can put a referral list on the site if that'd be helpful, Karen.
That'd be fantastic. That would just be fantastic. Are there any books that you are reading, or sort of are your go-to recommendations, or podcasts? But let's start with books.
As I was thinking about this talk, there's this great book of actually sermons by a guy named Samuel Wells, fantastic Lutheran pastor, called "Be Not Afraid." And I've been reading those for the last several weeks, and they've been super helpful. That's one book I would point to.
Great.
Yeah, and I think when thinking about your story, a really helpful kind of foray into that is "To Be Told" by Dan Allender. Talks about, it just gives more about story, what it is, how to like get into it. Has both a book and a workbook. Not that students right now might be looking for anything else to do, but at some point, I think that's helpful. And yeah, that's maybe my first go-to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, we have about 4 minutes left, so I'm interested to know, Tim or Ellen, any final words you have for us, or anything that's coming up for you after this conversation, as this conversation ends?
I think it's just been really fun to be with you all, and just to maybe remember that this is not a fast process necessarily. That so much of the world we lived in, at least 6 weeks ago, was so fast, and to actually do the thing that we are inviting you to do does mean to slow down, and that will bring up its own anxieties. And so just to sort of be ready for that, and to be ready that to slow down might actually cause some anxiety. And maybe that's part of what we're all dealing with, is like everything that we sort of went to before magically disappeared in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add, we've talked a lot about this idea of presence. And so often the presence of God is mediated through the presence of others. And that's been one of the hardest things about this time, is the presence of others has been taken from us, right? In many real ways. And for some people, the presence of others that we do experience is painful in our homes. And so I just, again, want to stress that kindness in this time in particular. And what you said, Ellen, about this is not a short process. What we're talking about today is like a lifelong process, you know? And so we're addressing in the midst of this social isolating pandemic, but like it will continue beyond this. And so be kind to yourself as God is kind to you.
A good final word. So as we go today, with our thanks to you, Ellen and Tim, for encouraging us, for naming what we're experiencing right now, and giving us a reminder of the hope of God's presence and love. We're so grateful to you and the work that you do with so many of us. So may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever he may send you. May he guide you through the wilderness, protect you through the storm. May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Amen. And so a final word for students. We're doing evening prayer and conversation on Wednesdays at 5 on Zoom, of course. We'll be posting this on the Theological Horizons website. And if you have follow-up questions for Ellen and Tim, or you'd like to get in touch with New City Counseling, happy to help make that connection. So peace be with all of you. Thanks again, Tim and Ellen.
Thank
and
you.
blessings. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye all.